Hey folks, welcome to the Unsung podcast. I'm having a bad fucking time. I'm joined by Chris Cusack remotely. I can see his eyes almost.
Yeah, I've got that blurry effect on to the Ivanka Trump effect.
And it wouldn't be a remote recording session if we weren't joined by somebody from Italy. Now, would it?
Ferruccio, ciao.
How you doing? Good to see you again.
Real good. Now, Ferruccio, I promised I'd let you in on this. One of the reasons that Mark is angry is because he's a white male and he lives in Glasgow, and that means that in the last week he didn't get to see the Red Hot Chili Peppers or Guns N' Roses because they both cancelled their mega huge outdoor shows on the day of the concert.
Okay.
Just to ensure my reputation isn't fully sullied, I don't like the chilies.
It's only half sullied.
It's only half sullied.
But I would like to put a heavy dose of I told you so in here, because for anybody that listened to our last podcast about United Nations, we had a fairly hefty Paul McCartney chunk at the start where we mused on the fact that Paul McCartney's still cutting it for nearly 3 hours at Glastonbury when so many other legacy acts just are not cutting it. And the Red Hot Chili Peppers show is ostensibly cancelled on health grounds, although it seems like Kiedis lost his voice, right? And the actual Rose show. The Guns N' Roses show was cancelled ostensibly on health grounds also, which I've heard is because he also lost his voice based on the previous performance. He was really, really struggling in that. So, you know, these fuckers, I mean, maybe to a lesser extent the Chili's, right? But Guns N' Roses really can't cut it. And people really need to start recognising when they can't cut it anymore. Please, tell me I'm right.
Axel's had numerous surgeries on his voice, and he's supposed to have learned how to sing properly by this point in his career, you would hope, right? Given that he's a multi-million-dollar recording artist. So it beggars belief, you know. I think one of the reasons he probably lost his voice is because they played 2 shows on the bounce.
That's a heavy touring schedule, that. 2 shows in a row.
2 3-hour shows back to back in London and Tottenham Hotspur Stadium. But yeah, I was on. You know, my friend said to me the other day, with them cancelling the show, at least you got the genuine Guns N' Roses experience, and I think that's
exactly. I always remember Guns N' Roses being like no show or
very on brand.
Yeah, what we're facing in Glasgow is a revolt of 50 to 60 year old white males, though, denied their funk and their rock and roll. The Solid Rock Cafe is in uproar. Tables are being flipped.
But can I start as a 50-year-old man? Can I start a campaign for the reappreciation of the early part of the Red Hot Chili Peppers career?
How early?
Yeah,
How early?
Very early. I mean, at least up to Blood Sugar Sex Magic. I get to that point. I don't know. They weren't as bad as we pictured them. Then they became very bad. I mean, they are listenable. Okay, I give it to you.
Flea's a good player. He's also an actor. He's actually in Obi-Wan Kenobi. He plays a character in that, which is completely bizarre. Didn't know that. Really bizarre.
But you know, like when Flea talks about music, and I read, for instance, his liner notes for the reissue of the Gag of Force first album. It's an act of love. You know, what he wrote about that album is great. You know, he's got something. You know, that guy.
Yeah, well, let's transition seamlessly then from a band populated by extremely white guys to a band populated by extremely not white guys.
Yes,
we have a really, really great record to discuss this week for any number of reasons. I mean, this is technically my choice, right? But we're going to dive into the realms of a phrase, proto-punk, and we couldn't possibly discuss that, even in passing, without the PhD, the doctor himself.
The doctor.
I've just lost all my credentials by trying to with my Red Hot Chili Peppers defense speech.
Well, I was going to say, Ferro, I just got a phone call from Glasgow University there asking for you to return your PhD post haste.
The things I heard in that faculty and that department, you know, I heard worse than this. I can tell you.
So we'll start off with a bit of disambiguation. This week we're going to discuss the band Death.
I can remember when we didn't want to see my face. I can remember
and we're going to discuss an album called For the Whole World to See, which was technically released in 2009, albeit it was recorded way back in 74. We are discussing Death from Detroit. We are not discussing Chuck Schuldinger's band, Death, the metal act, also a very worthy band, maybe even a band we could mention on this show at some point. But yeah, this is the Detroit band, Death, proto-punk, early to mid-70s. So for anybody that finds this episode engaging, I would highly recommend you investigate a documentary from 2012 called A Band Called Death.
Yeah, it's wonderful. I watched that recently as well.
Fantastic
Documentary.
Really great place to start. 3 African American brothers, 3 of 8 siblings, David, Bobby and Dennis Hackney. The dad was a Baptist preacher. He famously sat his children down and made them watch the Beatles' appearance on Ed Sullivan in 1964, and for the 3 in question, that set them on their way with a passion for music. I noticed that apocryphally, David found a discarded guitar in an alleyway the very next day after the Beatles' performance and began learning. That seems a little convenient, like it may have been sort of abbreviated in a Hollywood style to fit a useful timeline. But regardless, he did get into guitar, and supposedly from a kind of discarded instrument that he discovered at some point. And they then invested in instruments properly as a result of financial settlement that their mother received. I'm not entirely sure what the settlement was. I don't know if it's anything to do with the fact that their dad passed away.
No, it was something in the documentary they mentioned that it was something completely different. I think she was involved in an accident or something like that.
Right.
Because they were still playing. They were playing music and they were practicing in their bedroom when their dad was still alive. And the story about that is really quite good actually, because they all went to a music shop in Detroit and bought like the best kit they could buy, and it was like a fucking Fender guitars, Rickenbacker bass, great drum kit, and set it up in their bedroom and just jammed forever, like for 3 hours a day, driving the neighbours mental.
Yeah, I saw the anecdotes of their neighbours getting really fucking wound up by the constant practices.
See the song Keep On Knocking? That's about the girls who used to hear the music and come and knock on the front door. It's brilliant.
So yeah, as you may have noticed in those release dates, this album came out in 2009 on the Drag City imprint, but it was actually recorded in 74. Mm-hmm. When the band originally split up in 1977, or split up in asterisk, they'd only released one single under the name Death, Politicians in My Eyes, a song we'll get a hefty mention later on.
The number one biggest game is when they gain number fame. It's like a race at the top because they wanna be boss. They don't care who they step on as long as they get along. Politicians in my eyes.
They actually then went on to do something completely different. They became the Fourth Movement, a gospel rock act.
Would you run to the Bible, become a disciple, and curse yourself down to your grave? What you better inside, this is Revelation Z.
After which David left, the other 2 brothers went on and formed, I think it's a reggae group called Lamb's Bread.
That's right.
Your love, it makes me international. Your love, it makes me international.
I know that David struggled with alcoholism for a lot of his life, and he passed away in the year 2000 prior to this big kind of rediscovery of the band's catalogue.
Lung cancer, yeah.
Is that what it was? Yeah.
Yeah.
I didn't know that. So this cult fame that they've acquired that happened retrospectively. Mm-hmm. It kind of began via a friend of the group, a guy called Don Schwenk, who was originally due to do the artwork for their original LP. Now, we are technically talking about their original LP, but we'll explain what happened there, because it didn't come out in the form it was meant to come out in on the label it was originally mooted to come out on. So this guy Don Schwenk had been lined up to do that artwork, and the band had given him a box of the original singles as a thanks, The Politicians in My Eyes. The tracks were ripped at some point and ended up on the internet, in large part actually thanks to a site called Chunklet and a record collector called Ben Blackwell. And they began to sort of slowly spread around collectors' circles and file sharing sites online. And eventually, I guess, just through word of mouth, Drag City and other labels heard about this and started making inquiries about release, because this band had accumulated a sort of organic cult following due to this file sharing and due to this sort of dragging them back from oblivion, you know. Around about the same time, Bobby Hackney, the bassist and singer, his sons Julian, Urian and Bobby Hackney Jr. had come across their dad's recordings via chance encounter. I heard different versions of this, but something to do with a roommate.
Yeah, it's in a documentary. He actually explains exactly what happened as to how he came across it, and it's quite a cool story. Basically, it was a roommate that he was in college with, who said, "Oh, I've heard this really cool band, you should check it out," and sent him, or basically let him hear the record, and he was like, that sounds like my dad. What's that all about? And he phoned his dad up, and he was like, "Dad, why didn't you tell me when you were in a punk band in the 70s?" And Dad was like, "Oh, you mean like Lamb's Bread?" And he was like, no, I've heard this song, Politicians in My Eyes, and keep on knocking. And apparently in the documentary, his dad was like, just like went silent and was like, "Yeah, that was us." And then it was just like, then he phoned his brother and was saying, "Look, our dad was in a fucking really great band and he didn't tell us." And then it just kind of spiraled from there, which is a really wholesome story.
So fascinating. So they then formed a trio. The sons formed this trio, sort of mirroring their dad's group, called Rough Francis, and they basically were effectively a death cover act, right, playing these songs.
Well, they've released 2 albums.
Those kids with retail swagger prance around like Mick Jagger. They smoke cigarettes. I see the silhouette.
Yeah, but the original manifestation of that. And around about the same time, a 2009 New York Times article following a Rough Francis performance helped to draw further attention to the legacy of death. And then I believe slightly later in 2012, a further New York Times article on the Drag City re-release and the history of death and all this lore really started to propel them into people's consciousness on a much bigger scale. So it's a totally bizarre and really, really fascinating little backstory that, you know, in a weird way, feels so appropriate to the show.
Yeah.
Because this great unsung band was languishing in almost total obscurity, to the extent that the band's children didn't know about the band, that it even existed. So, I mean, you can't get much more obscure than that. And yet somehow they were hanging on to the kind of popular sort of psyche. From the most tenuous threads, they managed to be pulled back in. I just think that's kind of beautiful, and it's really interesting. And what's even more beautiful, I think, is that it happened on merit. It happened because people really started talking about this music, and really, you know, there was no particular agenda, there was no like spin. The interest came after people started talking about it, and that's kind of wonderful.
It is. It's a beautiful thing. It's something that it's obviously something that could only happen in the internet age, right? And it's quite a wholesome thing, you know. There's not a lot of things you can say about the internet these days that are wholesome, right? And this is certainly one of them, because it wouldn't have happened otherwise. Like, there's probably a really good argument for saying that maybe like Bobby's sons would never have found out about their dad's punk band, you know, because there was only 500 copies of that record made.
Absolutely.
You know, I mean, and unless a conversation had come up, you know, then that was unlikely to happen. In the documentary, it's actually Dennis talks about teaching Urian how to play drums and stuff like that. And Urian now plays with the Armed, who are a really great noise punk band. Yeah. They will come up on the show at some point. Fantastic band. The Rough Francis most recent album was produced by Kurt Ballou, so they have a lot of connections with, I guess, the more modern scene, but the fact they come from such heritage is pretty staggering. They could never have discovered that without that through line of, holy shit, some guy in some record store found this record and it just became a thing. You know, it's staggering. It's really staggering when you think about it.
Don't you think this is secretly the dream of every obscure, failed band in the world?
Dennis says that in documentary as well. It's like a wee bit of the history in the band is going to come in here, but it kind of makes sense in context. when they were trying to get a record deal, after they recorded the songs, they apparently were rejected by all the record labels and all the major record labels in the UK because nobody liked their name because of the word death. People weren't having it. Clive Davis from Columbia Records funded the recording of the record, demanded for them to change their name, and they said no. Well, David said no, and the brothers backed him. Bob Danis actually says in documentaries like he would have changed it in a heartbeat.
Yeah, apparently David's quoted as saying, if we give him the title of our band, then we might as well give him everything else.
Exactly, you know.
And the funding, I think, on the recording was pulled. Is that right? Is that why there's only 7 tracks actually properly completed of the 12?
But the reason that this makes sense in context is like they were trying for so long to get a record deal, and then one of the reasons the band petered out is because they couldn't get one. And then Danis talks about in the documentary is like we got the phone call from a record label from Drag City. He was working as a janitor in a college, and it's like somehow the past has brought me back. It's like pulled me back, and we got that phone call from a record label that wanted to release our record under the name Death. Can you even imagine that? Like they experienced that thing you're just talking about. It's like it's what you always wish would happen. It's like they wished for that, and that wish died, and they let it go for 30 years, and then suddenly it's back. You know?
Yeah, we all dream about that little CD we have sitting in a second-hand bin somewhere, getting picked up by some future, Geffen, and then you get the call, hey guys, it's your time now. And, I mean, it's amazing. It's beautiful. That the use of the word death wasn't actually meant to be particularly negative. I mean, they've spoken about that quite a bit. That David had gotten quite into sort of, I don't want to say spirituality, but I suppose that is probably the most appropriate term. Mm-hmm. Especially following their father's death. And it was meant to just be a reflection of a sort of essential part of existence, like it's something that happens to everybody, an unavoidable part of being. In a 2016 interview with Hero magazine, Bobby said he never regretted the name, but does admit to often having wondered what things would have been like had they just agreed to change it. And I mean, that would haunt you a wee bit, I think, especially if you're working as a janitor. You'd be a better person than I if you didn't let that get to you.
A friend of mine called Pierpaolo de Ulysses got a pretty well-known punk label called Rev Up, and he started issuing albums from bands, obscure punk bands from both the UK or the USA, Canada, Mexico, and basically what he was doing was like simply calling people up. Even before he started doing this in the 90s, and back then he would actually, and I think he still does it sometimes these days, actually go through the phone book, and see how many, I don't know, John Smith. We knew that one of the guys from the band. Essentially, maybe at least just 1 7-inch or a couple of 7 inches or a famous demo tape or something like that, and he would actually call internationally these people, all the people named John Smith in, I don't know, Philadelphia, until he got the guy. Said, "Are you the guy who used to play in this band? Are you the guy?" And all these guys, most of them, maybe all of them, were like either dentists, professors, mechanics, I don't know, waiters, they would do any kind of job. And everyone was like incredibly surprised and incredibly happy. Some of them were like rather suspicious and said, why are you interested in this? It was just a teenage thing I've done. And it's got a full catalog, like hundreds of records of bands that are basically all like that. Most of them are like that, Some of them are like semi-legendary, others were completely forgotten. And it's full of stories like that. I mean, Death obviously has got a lot of things around it. I mean, the whole Death, the rediscovery of Death is interesting under many respects, and so it got a lot of attention. But there are like hundreds of stories like that, and this label from this friend of mine, he actually sells them all. Like he prints like 1,000, 2,000 copies of each album, and it's got people from Japan, New Zealand, Australia, South Africa, South America, Latin America, buying, and he sells them all because there's a
market there.
There's a market for made mostly by collectors, but some of those are really good albums. Like it's not just collector stuff. Like I have a few. I selected a few from his discography, his label's discography, and there's some stuff that is actually killer stuff. Like
you can totally believe it, because we all know those bands
exactly
that we thought had
Absolutely.
the right thing, but they
Absolutely.
just never did it. They couldn't
Our
keep their shit together.
friends are in bands like that. Many of our friends of ours are in bands like that.
Yeah.
So let's contextualise this a little bit, and Ferro, this is where your PhD comes in handy. Death or proto-punk? And proto-punk isn't something that existed at the time. That's really, really key to say. So there's actually, Wikipedia put it pretty well. The phrase is a retrospective label. The musicians involved were generally not originally associated with each other and came from a variety of backgrounds and styles. Together they anticipated many of punk's musical and thematic attributes. And all music has a quote, proto-punk was never a cohesive movement, nor was there a readily identifiable proto-punk sound that made its artists seem related at the time. What ties proto-punk together is a certain provocative sensibility that didn't fit the prevailing counterculture of the time. It was consciously subversive and fully aware of its outsider status. In terms of its lasting influence, much proto-punk was primitive and stripped down, even when it wasn't aggressive, and its production was usually just as unpolished. The genre also frequently dealt with taboo subject matter, depicting society's grimy underbelly in great detail, and venting alienation that was more intense and personal than ever before. So it became a thing in hindsight, is really what we're saying. But how far back can we track that? Because, I mean, a lot of them say, it grew from the garage rock movement in the 1960s. But I believe that you think it could even be taken back slightly further than that.
Of course, yeah. Some people maintain that there are examples of proto-punk starting already from the early 50s, like even some big names in rock and roll, have had tracks, songs, or moments which can be considered proto-punk, like Jim Vincent.
All was smart, the race was won. Here come the devil doing 100 more. Saying, I'm a ride and move man. I'm a ride and move man. I'm a ride and move man down the line.
The whole character of Jim Vincent, was pretty proto-punk. Eddie Cochran for the heaviness of his guitar sound, and
Shakedown. You see my hands how they shiver. You see my knees how they quiver. My whole body's in a jither.
Link Ray, for instance. Link Ray is considered one of the forefathers, for instance, because of how gritty his music was, especially talking about guitars.
You'd mentioned Wanda Jackson.
Wanda Jackson as well, yeah.
Some people like to rock, some people like to roll, but moving and a groove is gonna satisfy my soul. Let's have a party. Let's have a party. The racing into the store, let's buy some more.
Wanda Jackson, also being a woman rock and roller, wasn't a very common thing back then. So that makes her punk in a way already, and also the way she sounded, which was kind of this shrieking sound. This sound which was kind of extreme for pop music back then. Pop or rock and roll music. Little Richard, the intensity of his performances and the way which he defied also genre stereotypes. So, and then we have all these lesser-known rockers, like for instance, these so-called desperate rock and rollers, like Hazy Ladkins, who was a country rock and roll singer. He released this single called "She Said," which the Cramps covered.
She looked at me like a $9 $10 Jeep. She said.
Someone like Dwight Pullen, another pretty unknown rock and roller. These people were having like local hits in certain states of the U.S. For instance, Charlie Feathers.
Sun is gone down and you're uptown. You just out running around. A cave all is standing. You troubling me.
Charlie Feathers was another one. Can't Hardly Stand It. It's a song that comes to mind, which is, or The Phantom. This another character he used to play with a mask, with a wrestling mask, and he had this song called Love Me. That so you had all these borderline characters around the mainstream of rock and roll, or maybe people, mostly US, from the Midwest, or basically from small labels. They never had the success that obviously other people had. So those people sometimes, retrospectively, have been, as you said, have been labeled as proto-punk. And then in the mid-60s, you have those primitive, most primitive, I would say, British invasion bands. Those rely less on blues noodling, like the Kings or the Trogs. Very primitive, the Who smashing their instruments, being obnoxious, small faces. The Pistols have covered the small faces, and even them, was a song that was covered very often by the early punk bands. Even the early Stones, something like 19 Nervous Breakdown, it's pretty punk attitude.
Yeah, I saw Got Live If You Want It in '66 being referred to because of its rawness.
Absolutely, there's a song called She Said Yeah that opens the live concert, which sounds very punk, fast and raucous and super noisy.
So there was a series of bands coming out around about the same time in the States as well. You've got the Sonics, the Monks. You mentioned a band called The Seeds, who I'm not particularly familiar with.
Yeah, the Seeds, yeah. They're kind of a link between the garage, the more rhythm and blues based garage of bands like the Sonics, the Wailers, the Trashmen, with the new psychedelic sounds, that came out in the second half of the 60s. And they had the pretty nasty nasal vocals, which can remind of some punk singers like Johnny Rotten, for instance.
Yeah, of course.
And then you have 13 Floor Elevators, for instance. The Elevators were extremely raw in their sound, and they had this aloofness and madness, and very, very. They were psychedelic, but in a very, I would say, animalistic almost way. I don't know. And then Love. But by the way, Love had two black guys in their lineup, and Arthur Lee, the main singer-songwriter, was a black guy too, just to have another connection with death. And Love could have very sweet moments, but also very hard and aggressive songs, especially live. They were famous for being a super aggressive band, and there's not a lot of recordings of Love playing live, but they were famous for being particularly extreme and aggressive on the live front.
So anybody that heard our pop punk episode would have heard us making reference to the early days as well, at a band called Los Psychos from Peru in '64. Still considered one of the progenitors of the punk sound overall, with the harshness and the volume. But when you really get into the meat of the proto-punk movement is when you start to get bands like the Stooges
Yes.
and MC5 coming onto the scene, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, obviously, you know, the Velvet Underground, the Stooges, the MC5, the Modern Lovers, New York Dolls. I mean, those are the bands that really paved the way for punk rock, both in terms of sound and attitude. The minimalism in the lyrics from a band like the Modern Lovers that not only paved the way to punk, but also to alternative rock in general. You know, the idea that you could talk about small things, or like how annoyed you were by pretty mundane stuff, you know, wasn't really that popular before Jonathan Richman and the Modern Lovers. And then also glam rock, you know, if you think about it, like Bowie, Lou Reed, and the Transformer era, Lou Reed, Roxy Music, early Eno, T-Rex, but also I would say in terms of sound, also Slade, for instance, they were a pretty noisy band, you know, noisy and aggressive band. Those bands were the first love of many teenage punks. I mean, there's a famous photo of Sid Vicious with a Ziggy Stardust T-shirt going to the final Ziggy Stardust concert. So, and Bowie covered the Velvets and championed the Stooges already in 1972. So, you know, it kind of actually channeled a lot of the punk stuff into the mid-70s.
A couple of the names I'd seen kicking around in the UK and in London in particular, in the kind of like pub rock scene of London at the time. You had like Cock Sparrer and Dr. Feelgood. The Stranglers eventually came through there. And is it the 101ers that became the Clash?
Yes.
That kind of movement as well? So there was a whole realm of sounds sort of coalescing around this slightly more disenfranchised, aggressive, stripped back, raw aesthetic. And, you know, coming from garage rock, and the garage in garage rock, I think for people that haven't really put two and two together, quite often came from something as literal as young people who'd seen rock and roll, had got instruments, and would get together and rehearse in their parents' garage. You know, not the best equipment, not the best facilities, not the best performers, but they just had a sort of enthusiasm that made them create this music that became its own sound. You know, and probably the most obvious manifestation of that for people who are not familiar are like things like the White Stripes, where somebody in the band who's functional, you know, and a guy who plays this guitar really oversaturated and kind of quite aggressively, and, you know, that all stems from this entire milieu of these bands. It's just interesting because unlike the punk movement, or unlike the hardcore movement, or unlike the new wave of British heavy metal, these bands didn't have a sort of agreed upon set of criteria. They were coming to similar conclusions on their own, and that's quite a fascinating thing in itself, because it's not a top-down process, you know.
Absolutely. There was something going on in the garages, as you said. Sometimes in the big cities like New York, LA, and sometimes a lot of it was happening also in suburban America, for instance.
We don't want to be too Atlantocentric as well, so while we're talking about the things that were going on outside the big cities, there were other things going on in other territories as well. So Australia had its own little burst of sort of proto-punk energy. Apparently, anecdotally, the band The Pretty Things performed quite a famous tour in Australia in about 1965. That left a really big impression on the kind of Australian gig-going audience, and it led to groups like Radio Birdman and the Saints developing the sound that they developed. So this wasn't an exclusively sort of American, and certainly not an exclusively British thing. All these different areas brought different aspects to it. You had, as we said, the US had the kind of garage aesthetic, had this bootstrapped, unscripted groups with rough tones and almost aggressive vocals. With the UK, you had on one side, you had flamboyance and unique dress. Then on the other side, you had things like Hawkwind and Pink Fairies and sort of debauchery and drugs and psychedelia. And then you also had overall, I think, a kind of largely working class aesthetic and inclusivity. No need for like supreme musicianship that perhaps, if you're playing like Led Zeppelin or something like that, there's a level of like real instrumental capability that was necessary. A lot of these people were bootstrapping it. They were taking what they could and making the best of it, and it formed a sort of sense of counterculture around it. And I think that embryonic sense of counterculture went on to inform punk, and punk actually, if anything, embraced the lack of expertise. It pushed against it. It was like, I'm bad at guitar and that's why this band's great. And that's a fascinating thing to emerge.
Absolutely. I'm glad you mentioned non-Atlantic bands as well, because for instance, I could talk about bands from Yugoslavia, for instance, or from Japan, where we're actually predating some of the punk's sensitivity and aesthetic, in terms of sound, in terms of attitude. Also in Italy, there was a band called Schiantos, which as early as 1977, they were talking about how cool it is to make mistakes when you play,
Andate a lavorare, teppisti!
How cool it is to take the piss out of rock stars and their rotten lifestyle. If you read this interview with this guy called Frick Anthony from Bologna, from the town, he sounds like Johnny Rotten. He sounds like Marco McLaren. It sounds like all those punk rock big heads.
So basically, as we say, in Detroit, where you also have the Stooges and the MC5 and stuff, you have these three young African-American guys that originally called themselves Rockfire Funk Express, which is a fucking great name for a band.
They didn't know if they wanted to be a funk band or a rock band, so they decided to combine them.
they started out sounding or trying to be Parliament Funkadelic, and there's a great story about Bobby kind of walking through the crowd at an Alice Cooper show with his mum, I believe, and then catching part of the Alice Cooper show and just being totally wrapped by this performance, and he knew that was the direction he wanted to go in. I believe there was a bit of resistance from the band at first, and then I think David was eventually also converted to the same sensibility by The Who and that early British invasion that you were talking about.
That's quite interesting, that, because in the documentary, Bobby says that I'm not playing like Alice Cooper, I don't want to play music, essentially, was what it was. And The Who was a huge thing for David. I think the direct thing he said was, if I could play chords like Pete Townsend and lead guitar like Jimi Hendrix, I'd be the perfect guitar player.
So it's like my generation being that first big, high-impact Who arrival in people's consciousness, right? But what's fascinating is a lot of the names that we're talking about are white. I mean, you pointed out the exception with Arthur Lee and Love, but most of these people in this scene are young white men. Not even that many women, let alone non-white women. There's no denying that these three brothers, these three young African-American brothers starting a punk rock band in the early 70s is certainly worthy of comment. As big and as inclusive as the Detroit scene famously was, that's still a big step. There were prominent black figures in rock at the time and prior: Chuck Berry, Jimi Hendrix, Phil Lynott, Rosetta Tharpe.
I want to tell you the natural facts, that a man don't understand that good book right, and that's all. That's all. Yes, and that's all. That's all. They got to have religion now, I tell you that's all.
Tina Turner, and then there's also more overlooked figures like Norma Jean Wofford and was it Peggy Lady Bo Jones.
All night, clap your hands, people, you're too quiet.
People like that, you know, like African American women, furthermore, and another stage of difficulty breaking through into those audiences. But starting a full-bore rock band, a punk rock band, even though that didn't actually exist at the time, it was still a big deal, not least if you're going to call it Death. And bands like Death really did pave the way for non-white musicians in the punk scene. And I would suggest, especially since their rediscovery in 2009 onwards, because the profile was so low back then, you know, as we've already pointed out, they can't have had much of an impact. But since being brought back to our attention, and since it has highlighted the quality of what they were producing, I think you must have a generation of enthusiastic young non-white musicians that are feeling more inspired to get into a predominantly white genre of you know, punk rock music. I do think punk is outwardly an inclusive environment, or at least it tries to be, but the representation of minorities within it often hasn't reflected those ideals. It doesn't always translate. Some of that might be cultural, you know, different minorities have different predominance in different genres of music, I get that, but it must be true that when there are fewer role models that young folks can look at and directly identify with, even for, you know, superficial reasons such as skin colour, then they may be more inclined to feel like an outsider in that genre, in that audience, regardless of the best intentions of that genre. So it's very likely, in my opinion, that Death have probably done a lot, and certainly far more towards redressing that in the last decade than they were able to prior, when they weren't given that opportunity to come out.
They've often spoken about how like it wasn't expected of them for being three black guys playing this kind of music. It just was not, you know, not only was Detroit a good place for bands like the Stooges and that, it was also the fucking city of Motown, right? Mm-hmm. And in that city, black people were expecting black kids to play Motown, and these guys just were not doing that. And you're probably right, Chris. I think if you kids see role models and that's where they want to be, and if you're a black kid and you've never really seen a black person playing punk music, then it might seem as though it's not accessible to you, even though we know that it's an accessible place, that it was an inclusive place, it just might seem like it's a step too far.
Yeah, it tries to be, you know, it tries to be.
Yeah, I think there's two different things here, you know, there's like being inclusive, which is, I think, absolutely a lot of punk is, and being accessible, which it may not seem accessible to many people. You know, and those are two different things, I think.
We shouldn't forget, though, that, you know, one of the most important punk bands, for instance, in the American scene was Bad Brains. Bad Brains were I'd never heard an hardcore band from the US, not only from the US, I would say, not mentioning Bad Brains as one of the main influences from their music, basically. Yeah. I mean, they were absolutely adored by the entire punk community for what they've done musically. There's also another band that always gets overlooked when we talk about the contribution of black musicians to punk rock, which is called Pure Hell.
Every day it's the same old thing. Such an person in a circus ring. All of my friends wonder why I'm so sad, but I can't stop now. I feel so bad.
They were coming from Philadelphia, and they moved to New York in the mid-70s, and they were one of the bands hanging around the CBGB's Max Kansas environment. They disbanded quite early. They recorded an album, which is pretty amazing. But you know, and that's another band that maybe we should sometimes take a look at. They're kind of rawer compared to Death. They're very, very primitive, and they're another band that sometimes gets overlooked when we talk about black musicians in the punk scene. And I totally agree with what you said about Death being an influence on later generations rather than the original, let's say, punks, because I just said proto-punk is sometimes by definition it's a retroactive definition, and unfortunately that didn't have the time to influence anyone back then because of the reasons we just mentioned. And when you look at the bands that actually influenced punk, you just have to look at which bands got covered by the early punk bands. The Damned covered the Stooges. The Damned also covered MC5. The Sex Pistols covered the Small Faces. What you gonna do about it? But they changed the lyrics to "I want you to know that I hate you, baby," instead of "what you gonna help you." Penetration covered "Free Money" by Patti Smith.
So I think because of the longevity of a lot of the bands that you're mentioning, though, they've got quite substantial catalogues, and that's something that Death don't have as a result of the trajectory of their career and the way it played out. Just being together for those few years, that kind of abortive album, a bunch of demos, and then the project ends in 77 and isn't rekindled until 2009 when David has already passed away. He's been dead for almost a decade at that point. So there are very limited, mercifully for us as researchers, very limited other releases. I mean, straight off the bat, Death's other releases don't excite me in anything like the same way as the For the Whole World to See, which we're going to talk about. For the Whole World to See was reissued in 2009. Drag City followed that in 2011 with Spiritual, Mental, Physical, which is mainly a collection of early demos recorded between 74 and 76. Apart from one track, the third track on it called The Change, which was an instrumental which I think was recorded during those original United Studios sessions. It seems a little bit of an afterthought of a song. It's mid-tempo. It has some fun with tape loops towards the end. That record features some soulful moments, and there's also some bits of real raw energy. But overall it's a bit trashy, and I have to say it's also got one of the worst album covers we've had since ESG.
Yeah, it's pretty ugly. It's quite horrible.
Yeah, it's horrendous. In 2014 another record came out, this time 3 in Roman numerals, another archival release from the years after 1976 this time, and I think as a result of that it just sounds way better than the previous collection. I actually quite like parts of this album. The second track in it, North Street.
Every storefront is a hangout for kids with nothing to do. And when you're walking up North Street, keep your eyes behind you. See that chick on the corner, looking slick and...
Has a nice socio-political quality to it and a bit of Thin Lizzy running through it.
Yeah, it's the only good song on that, I think. The only thing I liked with North Street on that record.
It scuttles along on like 1 million tiny hi-hat strikes before they land the snare at the bridge for extra impact. It's quite cleverly written in that sense.
You don't know the seed you're planting. Go down North Street.
The fourth track in it, We Are Only People, really soulful, harmonised.
We are only people just passing by.
Interesting little number, a lot more mature than some of the more visceral early stuff. It sparks into life later on in the track. And the only other one that really jumped out to me was Restlessness, the fifth one.
A little child cries in the cold and bitter night. Why am I so all alone?
Which is a great wee riff that leans into these little bursts of solo guitar. I actually think that's one of their best moments. I think North Street's probably the tightest on the record, but Restlessness deserves a mention. The album tails off pretty badly, or it's really just a collection, tails off pretty badly after that with some really low audio quality, bit of a mishmash, because they're sort of scraping the barrel of what the band had even left lying about. But there's some good cuts in the first half of it. And then the only other thing really that they brought out was New, N-E-W, although I think it was originally meant to be N-E-U and then it was changed to N-E-W. Regardless, came out in 2015, and that was their first studio album, effectively, properly. It's totally fine. I mean, it's a very competent rock band. It's better than your average pub group. It's definitely lacking in the kind of captivating magic of the early stuff. I think this type of music, this standard of music, exists in abundance, and whilst it's a totally decent piece of work for existing fans, I doubt it'll set anyone else's world alight. Its main advantage is the high production levels that let you hear the band in their kind of full beefy stereo, albeit it's minus that original member Dave. But yeah, that is the grand total of Death's output, apart from the record in question, For the Whole World to See, which is also mercifully 26 minutes long. Is that shorter than 80s Matchbox Beeline Disaster, Mark?
I think so. I think it was 28 minutes.
Yeah, well, there you go, making it easy for us. Before we dig into this, I just want to ask, does anybody know what the ellipsis is before For the Whole World to See? Is it meant to be Death for the Whole World to See? Is that what that is doing there?
Well, that's how I read it. I don't know if that's true, but that's how I read it.
I wasn't 100% sure.
Was it the original title for an album, or was it decided afterwards? I don't know that. I mean, was it decided when they re-released it, or was it already meant to be that title back in the 70s?
Well, in the documentary, I think it's Bobby. He shows the actual master recording that they got, and it just says Death Songs on it. It doesn't have a title. So,
Death Songs would be a good name for an album.
yeah, absolutely.
So we mentioned the first track in that, Keep On Knocking. I mean, straight off the bat here, heads up, I think I like this tune more than anything by almost any other band we've mentioned here, except maybe Thin Lizzy.
Wow.
I was actually playing football on Monday night, and I found myself singing this throughout the entire game because I'd had it on in the car before it. And to be honest, if I'd been paying more attention to the game, we probably wouldn't have lost. But it's worth it. It has a classic rock and roll energy to it, a smoothness, I think, that reminds me of the kind of effortless Class of Phil lineup.
Yes.
The delivery is very, very competent and confident as well. The stop-start nature, also quite confident, deceptively mature for a band in their first release. And Bobby's a great singer. Without being showy,
absolutely.
He's a really good singer. David's licks are also perfectly judged in it. They bounce about so nicely. That song had actually originally been the B-side for the Politicians in My Eyes single, which was their only existing release during their actual original lifetime. So it's not technically previously unreleased, but as an album opener, it is a great, energetic, hooky start to a record. It's a terrific choice.
Oh yeah, I mean, to be honest, the main riff actually reminds me of Kiss, and a lot of Bobby's vocals actually remind me of Kiss throughout the record. But also, I get a lot of The Who. A lot of The Who. His good, like David's guitar playing is clearly very influenced by Pete Townsend, and that's fucking cool, man. These guys were so fucking tight. They started in 1971. They recorded this in 1975. It's been kicking about
74.
It says on Wikipedia 75, mate.
No, 74.
Either way, they've been playing for a long fucking time, man, in their bedroom, and they had clearly turned into really great players, you know. And this is a really good encapsulation of what makes Death so good. The vocal is right
as a standalone soundbite. I love Death.
I love Death. The vocal is right. Yeah. As a standalone soundbite, that's. I love Death. I love Death. The vocal is right. Yeah. As a standalone soundbite, that's. I love Death. As a standalone soundbite, that's. I love Death. As a standalone soundbite, that's. I love Death. The vocals is right on, man. It's really melodic. It's really perfectly pitched for the type of song it is as well. The drumming is solid as hell. That changeover between the verse and the chorus is great. The middle eight is cool as fuck. David, like I said earlier on, David wanted to be a cross between Pete Townsend and Jimi Hendrix, and he's kind of going towards that with Louise playing guitar on this. Yeah. You know, it's catchy as hell, man. Absolutely. And it doesn't overstay its welcome. It's
a simplified take on Hendrix at times, and I like it. It's not exhausting. It doesn't get indulgent.
Imagine if they stuck around though, right? Imagine if they kept going. He would have become that guitar player. He probably did become that guitar player in private. He probably did, to be honest, you know.
Ferro, how do you feel about this tune?
Oh, it's fantastic. I mean, it's a... As you said, it's a perfect choice for an opener for an album like that, and you know, it's. I agree with you with the Thin Lizzy vibe, you know, especially in the delivery. It's got a aggressiveness mixed with the smoothness that it's typical of Thin Lizzy. You know, I feel like that kind of delivery. It's a brilliant like rock and roll / punk song. It's one hell of an opening track. I mean,
I was just blown away by how much I liked that song. I really was.
It's amazing. It's amazing.
Second track, Rock and Roll Victim, much more playful, frantic and punky with the odd semi-scream in it. It sounds like they're having a bit of fun. It's got an ADHD approach to structure that sees it jumping from like a charging passage to a ring off to a riff, and when that chorus is actually allowed to motor, it only happens in short spells, but when it motors it really works. I also think that the claps in it were a really endearing touch, and it kind of contributes to that sense that they were having fun doing it.
Yeah, this actually reminds me of the Stooges a little bit. It's that snarling vocal, which I think, you know, is in the verse, which is pretty good. Apparently David used to just learn records back to front on guitar. That's one of the things they talk about in the documentary, is that they would come home and he'd just like learn like a whole Who album and stuff like that, and he'd just would play it over and over again. The drumming on this is tight as hell. The groove is just perfect for the song. And yeah, you're right, the hand claps is just a nice touch, you know. It's the song is riff central, man. It totally is. Like, even though it's a bit disjointed in places, it is just full of riffs, and it's really urgent, you know. It's got that energy about it which makes the best punk records.
Feel that are really real. Establishment don't want no part of us.
Yeah, I agree about the Stooges influence. Also Alice Cooper, I hear like this angst, you know, that's getting. Yes, it's frantic. It's one of the most punkier songs on the. Also, Rock and Roll Victim. I mean. It can be seen also as a critique of the rock and roll lifestyle, you know, as a decadent and indulgent rock. So we introduce some punk themes, also lyrically.
That's true. Yeah.
They had a lot of that going on, you know, like criticizing show business in general, you know, that and a lot of that going on. So sorry, my pronunciation doesn't help. Distinguishing between words. Anyway, you know, so and this song is an example of that, and I think when I heard the record for the first time, hearing these like double whammy these two songs, I said, wow, come on. I mean, this is really, because sometimes, you know, how many times we've been told, oh, okay, this is the original proto-punk band, you know, and then you go to listen to the album and say, yeah, but you know.
Yeah, exactly.
They won't take, you know, the Stooges or the MC5's crown, you know. In this case, hearing these two songs, say, well, come on, these guys are pretty legitimate when we talk about proto-punk, you know. And I think these two songs played back to back are kind of as punk as anything you would hear in 1977.
It's formidable. It's a formidable start to a record.
Yeah.
You know, you mentioned earlier on about Motown and the backdrop to these kids' lives, and I think the third track, "Let the World Turn," gives a real nod to that upbringing.
Whatever is behind you, leave it past. Can you see
The main vocal has a really timeless soulfulness to it. The fact it's double tracked, although, and then hard panned, maybe makes it a little bit more psychedelic than your average song from that oeuvre. But after that dreamy start, it slowly comes to life about a minute and a half, bursts into action at 2 minutes 15, giving it a sort of sense that it's working in phases. And you know what, I was thinking, like, for a fairly punky record, you've got this tune that starts going through chunks in a sort of like kids version of Bohemian Rhapsody. Do you know what I mean? Like, you've got the singy bit and then the slightly more energy, then the kind of drive and middle bit, and then something that's a little bit pompous.
Yes.
Maybe even like Meatloaf as well, that kind of like Steinman sense of like modes and chapters in a song. There's a really metal bit of guitar play around 3 minutes, and then Dennis goes absolutely tits with this kind of bizarre but really effective drum solo. And it drops back down to the dreamy start, reignites again with that final guitar-based flourish. It's really ambitious and entertaining bit of music, and I think, again, makes it remarkable that these guys were so early in their career too.
These guys were listening to Led Zeppelin with this song, absolutely. I think there's no doubt about it. In a documentary, they talk about how David used to take apart telephones and fuck with the wires to create reverb on the telephone, then make prank phone calls to people. And I think that's exactly what influences the vocal production, you know, in the quieter parts and the way the guitars are like really reverby, you know. When the double track guitars come in and it goes big, it just sounds like The Who to me. Even the vocals get a Britishness to it and the vocal delivery. And that drum solo is essentially Moby Dick by Zeppelin. That's exactly, but it works, you know. The song does work in movements, and yeah, it feels quite a British song to me, probably because I hear Zeppelin and I hear The Who in it. But I love it, man. I think it's great, especially that drum solo, man. It's just completely over the top, but it's great.
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of the songs that dates the record back to the 70s more. Let's
totally.
be honest. I mean, also there's a part which is kind of proggy, you know. There's a moment where, you know, they go like yes or something like that, or they won't do something.
Yeah, it's a journey, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, I love the beginning. I love the beginning, so sparse and atmospheric. Then, and also the drum solo. Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, it's it's so over the top. But you know, not my favorite track on the album, but I think it really works well within the set list. I mean, it gives you that variety that you sometimes need, you know, on a punk rock record. So yeah,
it's good to show dynamics as well, you know. They're a dynamic band. They're not just straight up rockers, you know, which I think is really cool.
At the opposite end of their spectrum, you've got track 4, You're a Prisoner. And I think we mentioned Jack White. He'd have been really happy having this riff in his arsenal at some point.
Absolutely, man. Yeah,
it's this classy, energetic, simple little tune, just kind of bops along before dropping into that quite trippy minor key chorus. And it's another song that makes really good use of those little guitar flourishes to give the track a bit of movement and life.
Yeah, there's a bit at 1:30 where they do a sort of syncopated gallop thing. It's just a really brief moment. It really reminds me of Thin Lizzy. The staccato guitar followed by like a little riff. The Clash would do that all day long. And of course they never would have heard this, right? They would never have heard this band. But obviously they're pulling from the same well of influence. It's a really good song, like you said, simple, really good chord progression, really good chord choice as well. The chorus with the reverb and the way it changes the whole feel of the song is a really good touch as well. They were thinking about how they were doing this. They weren't just like banging out 3-chord fucking bangers like a lot of punk songs were.
It doesn't sound like a first record. It sounds way more considered than that, doesn't
totally.
it?
Yeah, absolutely great track, and it reminds me a little bit of the desperation in the chorus. It reminds me a little bit of bands like the Wipers, you know. This like almost post-punky punk, you know, you know, from the US, you know, mostly, or from Australia too. There's something that about their sound that reminds me of some Australian bands like the Saints, for instance, that we mentioned before. It's got this lyricism, it's got this desperation and angst in it, and yeah, brilliant track.
Freaking out. Every band should at some point in their career have a song that starts by shouting the name of your band.
Yes. That's so good, is it?
You know, this track was used in the is it Ash versus Evil Dead, I think.
Was it?
It's in that show, yeah. I think it's probably the punkiest one on here, right? Surely.
It's a skin, there's a fin. Why is my head spinning round in a dream? It's that time to please. Why all these lights popping up in my face? Or am I freaking out, freaking out, freaking out, freaking out, freaking out?
The lyrics just brilliantly capture that sort of vague teenage nihilism that works so nicely within that era of punk, especially where sing-alongs are concerned. And you know what? See, listening to this track, if it hasn't happened, I could totally imagine Green Day covering this song.
Yeah, I've actually said to you that like so many punk bands have doubled down on the entire idea of this song, just in general. The Ramones weren't far behind in the grand scheme of things, but it actually feels like it's of the same DNA, you know. I actually think the main riff might be more Cheap Trick than anything else, because it's quite playful. But it's a really, really great song, you know. Like I said, that main riff is just tremendous.
To me, it reminds me also of some groovy hardcore bands like Black Flag, you know, the way they go, freak it out, freak it out, freak it out, freak it out. There's this frantic thing, you know, but at the same time it's groovy, you know, and which was typical of, for instance, West Coast punk rock a lot. Also reminds me a little bit of Minor Threat as well. The how declamatory it is, you know, and you know, they got a lot of things going on, you know, and a lot of traces of what punk would become later. And
it's quite
and it's
rich, isn't it?
Yeah, it's one of the reasons why this record is a proper proto-punk album, because you can really see many developments, many things that would later be developed by the proper punk bands, you know, the punk bands which came around 76, 77.
Mark, it's interesting you said the Ramones, because I actually think track 6, Where Do We Go From Here, the central refrain really reminds me of the Ramones.
100%, yeah.
Really unconventional start with the kind of drum guitar blasts. It's another classy wee moment, and I think that guitar, bass, vocal and drums synchronized descent in the pre-chorus is just excellent. Such a good bit.
In my own opinion, you are not defending. You are the worst. You make the world like a circus and you're trying to curse us. Cruel, you know no bounds.
The chorus of this one is probably the singiest part on the record, and it's got that nice straightforward approach that, you know, it's why people love the Ramones, let's be honest. All the mischief in this one is left for the verses, and it works really well with Bobby having some real fun on his bass in particular. He really goes to town in this one, and it finishes with a nice mildly chaotic rock out ending too.
Yeah, I think this is my favourite song on the album, to be honest. The vocal on it is fantastic. The bass line is also brilliant. like you said, Chris, the chorus is Ramonesy. It's so simple, it's so punk. It's got a really nice bluesy breakdown around 2 minutes, which I enjoyed. And I do, like, towards the end, I like the way they tried to explore different song structures. You know, it could easily have been the same thing repeating over and over and over again, but decided to just fuck around with it and see what happens, and the results were pretty good.
Yeah, the chorus reminds me also a little bit of the Misfits.
Yes.
Like the
Oh,
from here.
Yeah.
It's got that.
They could totally cover it.
Yeah, Danzig. Yeah. And it's got this again. This lyricism, you know, this and also this
EFI.
desperation. Like it's dark in a way. It's dark desperation, you know. And absolutely great track. Yeah, I agree. It's one of my favorite tracks on the album. A total anthem.
So, talking about anthems, the 7th track and the last track, Politicians in My Eyes.
The number one biggest game is when the kingdom of fame is like a race at the top because they wanna be boss. They don't care who they step on as long as they get along. Politicians in my eyes.
Now, this was the original single released during their lifetime. I know, I just want to make that really, really clear. It's, I think, the best known of people that do vaguely know about them, just because it's partly because of the refrain. But if you can say best known about anything with this band, this one is probably the one it applies to. I also actually get some ESG flavours from this one. The simple, fun bounciness in it. The instrumentation is just brilliantly arranged. The Bobby's kind of frantically laying the bass down for some really sparse guitar stabs by David. You know, he really pares it back and lets Bobby do the majority of the work in this. The chorus, I think, has a distinctly modern, melancholy, political edge to it that we could fit into a number of post-hardcore things from the late 90s, albeit it's a bit rougher sounding. Then it drops into the fun, funkier verse again. I love a choked hi-hat. I've said that many times in this show. Anytime somebody's choking out a hi-hat, fantastic. And Danis matching the vocal on that main line with those choked hi-hats, that's catnip to me. 3 minutes in, it also launches into this big rock ending that brought to mind, for me, early Alice Cooper. Danis lets loose with some really hefty fills and crashes. David really dials it up to maximum with some ducks and dives and fretboard slides, and then he absolutely saturates the shit out of it. It's like he's had a nuclear distortion pedal sitting off to one side that he's not used yet at any point, and he steps in it, and the fuzz just, 11 out of 10 here. They must have ripped this one up live, because you can tell the last minute or two of the song is spent with the three brothers jamming out in a frenzy before they meet for that one final sort of synchronised hurrah. They just sound like they're having a blast at the end of this one. Yeah, I think that first riff is probably my favourite riff on the whole album, but I also really enjoy how it's a bass-led groove. You know, the guitars bouncing about the speakers, the reverb on the left and right with each sort of stab. I bet you Flea loves this one. Yeah, I bet he does.
I was about to say that exactly.
In the documentary, they explain how when nothing was happening for Death, they moved from Detroit to Vermont, and they jammed there and tried to make things work, which is when they did the fourth movement stuff, but it ended up not happening. And David went back to Detroit, and Bobby and Danis just kept playing, expecting them to come back, and they didn't. And that's when they formed Lamb's Bread. And you can totally hear that rhythm section synchronization happening way back at this point. You know, that bass and drum groove is like so locked in, letting David go wherever he wants to go with the guitar. And a lot of the time, for the first half anyway, it's just single stabs before that ending, where his guitar becomes monstrous. Like, it's a proper big, get your head out, swing it round sort of rock ending. It's tremendous, man. Yeah, it's just fucking really good. There's a lot of trust in the arrangement. You know, there's a lot of faith in each other to hold the song together and passing the baton of who's kind of driving things at different times. You don't have that dictator thing going on where one person is constantly driving the songs. I like that about it. It feels quite democratic. Yeah.
Yeah, that's why the song reminds me also a bit of bands like post-hardcore bands, or hardcore bands, which later on influenced the so-called post-hardcore sound, like Minutemen, for instance. When you have this very locked thing, the melody is very locked within the groove, and there's a shift of points of view sonically speaking. It reminds me also of bands like Toiling Midgets. All these bands were trying to play with structures as well as energy and rawness. Great closer for the album.
So, I mean, despite the fact that this album is relatively new in my life, I just felt really confident bringing it to the table here. As I said, there are moments on this that I enjoy as much as almost any of their better-known peers. I don't think it has acquired some sort of fetishistic insider esoteric appeal or indeed any novelty points given the lack of young black men in the scene at the time. I think it's genuinely re-emerged due to quality, and also thanks to the efforts of some real music enthusiasts that brought it back from oblivion. This album is probably the fairy tale of what we try to do with this show. As I say, pluck something from obscurity and get it circulating again, because things get missed. Nobody's necessarily to blame, but thankfully this demonstrates that that phenomenon can happen. I really like it, and I hope that we can play some small part in its inclusion in the conversation of that early to mid-70s proto-punk canon, because I really, as Ferro says, it's not there as a novelty, it's there because it fucking kicks ass. And even I, once I heard about it, but before I'd heard it, didn't expect it to be as good as it is. But I was pleasantly
I
surprised.
was just saying, as much as we cannot call it as unfortunately, for the unfortunate events we've been talking about, we cannot call it as an influence on the early punk bands because of the short time that the band was around and the fact that the record wasn't released back then. It certainly can be ascribed as one of the first examples of what we call punk rock before ante litteram, as I said, before the term was even invented. I mean, okay, people were using the term loosely also during the 60s a little bit, but punk rock as a movement, wasn't there at all when Death were recording this. And yeah, absolutely, it's a proper proto-punk album. I mean, it really deserves its title, and it should go in the same, what we put the same place where we put the Stooges, the MC5, New York Dolls, and all those bands. Modern Lovers. It's there. And it's great that it's been rediscovered. I mean, it's, we live in an era where a lot of stuff gets repackaged and resold, in a way. In this case, though, the hype is totally justified, if you want to call it hype, and it really deserves its title. And it's a great album. It's a great unsung album that finally it's getting recognized.
Yeah, I think you're both right, Chris. It does kick ass, and Ferro is just as good as the Stooges or any other proto-punk album. I remember hearing about this record when it first came out, seeing the news articles and some of the reviews, but I was not in the frame of mind back then to check it out. 2009. Watching the documentary gave me an even greater appreciation for it after I first heard it. I think that this ticks all the boxes for me for this podcast, much the same as it does for you, Chris. It is a band which has a little bit of hype, which justifies the hype, which is an old band, which is unsung by every single fucking metric you can think of. It's a shame that it's not quote-unquote influential, because it clearly should have been. It does have a lot of the same sonic similarities as many other bands who are hugely influential and arguably aren't as good either. And I absolutely think that this has to be something that's been in the discography, otherwise we're not doing our job right.
Agreed. Class. Well, I'm really pleased that we got to discuss it, and I think also during that discussion we've brought up a few other bits and bobs that we'll probably revisit, because it's such a rich seam, and it's such an interesting phenomenon, the way that sound coalesced without the sort of Malcolm McLaren plan. It's just something that organically formed, and look where it got us. So yeah, cheers. Yep. All right, and so to go with Death, we have a Nexus.
Nexus or Death.
A complicated series of connections between different things.
So Pitty is taking on Ferro as usual, throwing obscure British pop culture references at him and expecting him to like this stuff up.
It was a fucker, by the way. It was a total fucker.
So this week from the tub we pulled out Bob Todd as chosen by listener Chris Hind. Bob Todd, I had no fucking idea. I had to go digging.
Yep.
So, an actor from a variety of sort of 70s TV, 60s, 70s, and even early 80s.
He knew Spike Milligan and he knew Benny Hill, which kind of...
He was a straight guy, quote, in Spike Milligan's stuff, wasn't he?
Yeah, and he was in a lot of Benny Hill stuff, and he was also in a lot of those softcore porn films in the 70s about
the window cleaner
shit,
type,
all that kind of stuff. Yeah. Not as a performer, as a straight man. Again, that's not the right term to use.
All right, so I'm going first in this one.
Yep.
Death, the Reformed Death, played Joey Ramone's birthday bash in 2009 in New York City. Now, Joey Ramone died in 2001, but every year since, his brother and his mum have put on this charity event, and in 2009, a reconstituted Death took part in that. That event also featured Handsome Dick Manitoba. Ferro, you see you nodding, you obviously know who that is. So that's a former member of the Dictators.
Singer of the Dictator.
And the singer of the MC5 reunion version as well, I believe.
That's right.
In 2004, Handsome Dick Manitoba threatened to sue the English act Manitoba, also known as Dan Snaith, who then had to change his performing name to Caribou. Okay. Caribou is a pretty well-known act for people that listen to sort of indie electronica, so it hasn't hurt Dan Snaith too much. By the way, at this point, I did consider going down the route of quantum physics and maths here, given that Dan Snaith's got a PhD in some aspect of maths, and his genius sister has a PhD in quantum physics of some description, but frankly, our listeners need something that's got a little bit more bang. So, in 2020... Primavera tried to lift everyone's spirits during lockdown with a Gal Gadot-esque video collage of various Primavera stars singing along with the allegedly jubilant Caribou track Can't Do Without You.
Can't do without you. I can't do without you. I can't do without you. I can't do without you.
Frankly, I don't like the fucking bit of music at all, but it's got a bunch of bums sing. I think there's about 100 of them throughout the course of the video in some form singing along with this, and it features, you know, people you like, people you don't know who the fuck they are anymore, people dancing, those kind of folk. It also features James Newell Osterberg Jr., aka Iggy Pop. In 2012, Iggy Pop released a cover of the song La Vie en Rose by Edith Piaf.
Really?
Yep.
That's insane.
Now, Edith Piaf is a strangely controversial figure in one respect. She was actually accused of being a traitor and a Nazi collaborator due to her friendliness with the occupying German forces in France during World War II. Getting the Nazis in there, guys.
Of course.
In that period, she performed regularly for the occupying forces and the officers, and indeed became quite prosperous as a result of that, buying a supposedly exquisite flat in the 16th arrondissement in Paris, and was even invited at one point to do singing tours in Germany. She was later involved in a series of purge trials that sought to expel collaborators from areas of French society, including radio, in the years after the war. However, a key figure in the French resistance actually came to her aid, testifying that Piaf had been instrumental in helping a number of prisoners escape following her performances in concentration camps during the war. It's never really fully been decided where people stand on Edith Piaf. in that sense, but certainly he came to her aid. Despite the controversy, she was one of the first performers to appear at the Moulin Rouge in 1944, mere days after the liberation of Paris. The Moulin Rouge is obviously very famous. Showgirls and musicals, the art of Henri Toulouse-Lautrec and Alfred Schubach, classical performances, even at times closed for private events, including one for Queen Elizabeth II. But no show that took place at the Moulin Rouge is more artistically revered than that of Le Pétoman, the stage name of legendary 19th century French flatulist, i.e. professional farter, Joseph Pujol. He was a man with such exquisite abdominal control that he could musically fart along with orchestras, powered only by charcoal briquettes that helped him create enough gas. However, apparently in later life his control of his abdomen waned, resulting in what I can only assume were messy performances. There exists a 1979 short comedy film starring cult British actor Leonard Rossiter as the windy maestro himself, Joseph Pujol, written by the creators of Steptoe & Son and featuring comedy actor and, by the way, ex-farmer Mr. Bob Todd as Joseph's father. I'm sure you've both seen it. You know that Bob Todd tried to become a farmer but just completely crashed and burned, and then blagged his way into acting.
Brilliant.
You know, there's also an Italian film called Il Petomane with Ugo Tognazzi, one of the main Italian comedy actors of the 60s, 70s and 80s. And it's about the same character, about the Pétomane, the famous Pétomane. And I didn't know it's a British movie. The British film. Check it out.
There you go, Mark. Farting and Nazis.
Farting and Nazis. Yeah, I think I might actually, you know. I'm not even kidding. Okay, so Death recorded this album at United Sound Systems in Detroit. I can't remember the name of the record label that operated there. It was Groove something. But apparently they found that record label just by literally opening Yellow Pages, sticking it on the wall and throwing a dart to see which studio would release their record, and that was the one they chose. Anyway, they recorded it at United Sound Systems in Detroit, which is now a place of historical significance in America. Many artists have recorded there over the years, including Eurythmics and Aretha Franklin, who did a cover of Sisters Are Doing It For Themselves. Eurythmics feature Annie Lennox, of course, Scotland's very own, who is a bit of a pop culture icon. Throughout the years, she's appeared on many TV shows, not just as a performer, but also just as a guest, including in 1997, Nevermind the Buzzcocks. One of the captains of Nevermind the Buzzcocks when it was on the BBC, not the Sky version, which exists now, with Greg Davies, with Phil Jupitus. He was one of the captains. And many people have appeared alongside him over the years, including Dappy from the act N-Dubs. Remember N-Dubs?
Oh my God, yeah.
Phil Jupitus actually wore one of Dappy's stupid hats when he came on the show. That was in 2007, I think. I could be wrong there. Anyway, Dappy has been in court a few times for assault and battery. He's one of the guys.
Yeah.
And the most recent was in 2014. In that trial, Jim Davison actually attended and lent his support to Dappy, saying, Dappy is a good friend of mine. I don't know what happened in this case, but I'm just here to show my support.
You're on the wrong side of history, Dappy.
Jim offered to be a character witness and Dappy declined. When Jim Davison was not toxic as fuck, he had a thing called the Jim Davison Show. He actually did the Jim Davison Show a few times over the years, but the first iteration of it was in 1980 to 1982.
I quite liked it, but I had no idea his feelings on Pakistanis.
Yeah, Bob Todd was one of the guests on that original run of the show.
So, that makes sense, yeah.
There you go.
Well, Ferruccio, most of those names will mean absolutely nothing to you, mate, but in most cases, you're not losing out.
No, I know, never mind the Buzzcocks, but, you know, a few other things, apart from obviously Annie Lennox and the Eurythmics, which, by the way, were the first band I ever listened to as a child, you know.
Oh, wow.
My first musical obsession were the Eurythmics.
You were raised right. So, Mark, we're going to go from a very woke episode this week to An absolute fucking humdinger next week. Now, next week we have another academic on the show. Thank fuck, because she's going to take the flak for this one. Mark, do you want to introduce this? Well, Ferro and I suck air in through our teeth.
So we've already done an episode on cancellation. So we're going to double the fuck down.
Good luck.
And well, we're not going to get cancelled, but this band are definitely cancelled. We're doing The Devil and God Are Raging Inside Me by Brand New.
Okay.
I'd like to underline at this point that the academic that's going to be on the show is female, so that should make things a little bit more interesting, given that, you know, Jesse has had issues in the past with females.
Yeah, he has. So Marissa Androvic is joining us next week, and Marissa is an expert on many disciplines that will come to bear on the discussion. Not just the fact that she's into punk rock, but she's very learned. Is she learned enough, though, to nexus that horrible wee bastard Jesse to somebody? And let's find out who that somebody will be. So Jesse Buhis Lacey to...
Brand new. There's 4 guys in that band.
Fucking hell. To Pepin the Short, as chosen by that guy Kenny Bonella again. That's 2 times this month he's been out and he's always causing trouble. Pepin the Short to Jesse Lacey.
No idea what that is, mate.
Let's see what it takes us.
Interesting.
Ferro, thank you so much. Listeners won't know this, but I'm actually flying over to Italy to hang out with Ferro in about 7 days' time. So, mate, I'll see you soon.
I'll see you next week.
Ciao.
And I'll see you next week too. Ciao.